It kind of looks like I'm in a haze or have some sort of weird rash, but it's me, Darren Devivo, with you here. And welcome to another edition of Things We Said Today, a Beatle podcast that is about the Beatles together and apart, everything and anything related to the Beatles. We talk about it here on this show that we try to come up with every other week. But here in 2025, back-to-back weeks with an examination of the book, The McCartney Legacy, Vol.2, 1974 to 1980. And I'm joined by Ken Michaels, who is really the guy who was here from day one of Things We Said Today. You know Ken from his 40 plus years in broadcasting, doing Beatles programming on the radio, you were on Sirius before the merger, correct, Ken? It was not XM.
It was on XM.
You were on XM before the merger. In recent years, Ken has his own YouTube channel, Ken Michaels Radio. He hosts Every Little Thing, a syndicated radio show. And in addition to that, and those two things in this podcast, Ken's a co-host of Talk More Talk, a solo Beatles podcast. So he is all about the Beatles. You know Ken for that. And great to be with you once again, Ken.
Great to be here, Darren, Allan, and Adrian. And
Allan
I
is
can tell you,
actually Allan's sitting on the other side, not so much as the host, co-host, but as our co-guest. You know Allan from his decades of writing music, rock, Beatles, classical music for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and other publications. He has several Beatles books and classical books under his belt, but the focus is on the McCartney Legacy, which he is writing with our guest, our other guest, Adrian Sinclair, the McCartney Legacy, Vol.2 now out. You see them behind Allan. The red one is Vol.1. The blue one is the brand new Vol.2, which has now been out and there it is behind Adrian. It's almost a month now it has been out. McCartney Legacy Vol.2, and getting to talk about this great work. Allan, welcome as a guest.
Thank you, Darren. And hello, Ken, Adrian, everyone out there. Hi.
And before we introduce and talk to Adrian, Ken, do we have any news?
well, this could be the very shortest newscast you've ever had here on this show, which can happen when you're doing a show every week
Every week.
But this will be very brief. As you know, the Beatles recording of Now and Then has been nominated for the upcoming Grammy Awards for Record of the Year and Best Rock Performance. But you may not know this. John Lennon and George Harrison are not allowed to receive the award if the Beatles win in either category. Due to the Recording Academy rules, only McCartney and Starr are eligible to receive Grammys for the tune. Because Lennon and Harrison have each been dead for more than 5 years, they cannot meet the Grammy qualifications for new recordings, which stipulates that it must be material that has been recorded within 5 years of the release date. Both McCartney and Giles Martin are nominated for Record of the Year as producers of Now and Then, as are 8 engineer and mixers and a mastering engineer, but not John and George. This is according to Billboard magazine. This is really outrageous in a way. I don't know how you guys think about this, but obviously John's recording was from 1977 or so, and George helped out in the very beginning of Now and Then, so their recordings are on there, but because they're not new within the last 5 years, John and George wouldn't win, if it was Record of the Year.
Even though John
or Best Rock
wrote the song.
Yeah, that makes it even more ridiculous. We should write the Academy and just voice our opinions about this, and to me, it's kind of outrageous.
Are the people that run the Grammys also the same that run the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame?
Could be.
Because it sounds like Rock and Roll Hall of Fame logic.
All right, the Billboard charts, Wonderful Christmas Time has moved up the charts the last time I looked to number 26. McCartney II has jumped from 197 to 97, all because Wonderful Christmas Time is on it. And Give Me Some Truth, the compilation of John's, is on the album charts because Happy Christmas War is Over is on there. It's at number 127. And Abbey Road is at 146. Both Wonderful Christmas Time and Happy Christmas fell off the official singles charts in the UK. But Wonderful Christmas Time is still on the charts here. It's going to fall real quick. But it's just nice to know that at the end of every year, it makes an appearance. Paul racks up more points that way. Some reminders, Ringo's new album, Look Up, comes out this Friday, January the 10th. And Ringo has 2 concerts underway at the Ryman in Nashville. And that will be next week, January 14th and 15th. And I will be there. And I'll come back with a Southern accent.
That should be entertaining.
Yeah.
That's going to be great. I'm looking forward to your hearing what your thoughts on the shows are. And they are, again, we talked about this last time. These shows will be turned into a television special or some sort of concert film.
Yeah.
I understand. All right.
Well, there was a DVD that came out years ago when Ringo played the Ryman. So this would be a second
yeah.
one.
That's true. It was an all-star band. It was one of the more recent DVD releases from the all-star band, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm.
All right, that's it. That's it. That is the short news. Not much there. Get cracking for next time, Ken. Got to come up with more. And now we can formally introduce Adrian Sinclair, our guest, our special guest on the show today, the co-author of the McCartney Legacy series, now out up to Vol.2 with Allan Kozinn. And we may have talked about this maybe last time, a couple of years ago when Volume 1 came out. What is the genesis of this entire project? The McCartney Legacy. Who had the initial thought? How did the ball begin rolling? And how did it grow to what last I heard could very well be potentially a 5-volume series of books? Can you go back to day one and where'd the idea come from?
Wow, day one. So yeah, day one was about 10 years ago. And I decided in my spare time that I wanted to write a book about McCartney's solo work. And originally it was just going to be a discography and more like kind of Mark Lewison's, Beatles sessions book. So it would explore Paul's time in the studio, a lot like kind of what Luca Perazzi does, the Italian author. I actually engaged both Allan and Chip Madiger at first, and we were working as a trio. And eventually what happened was I wanted to develop the idea into a fully fledged biography, which would be multi-volume. Chip was kind of, more towards the idea of doing a discography, more like the books that Chip does himself. So we decided to part ways, and Allan and I continued with the project. And to cut a long story short, we took the book about 6 years ago to an agent in New York, our agent Matthew. And Matthew is a big Beatles fan and solo Beatles fan, like a complete Beatle nerd, like us guys. And he loved the idea, loved the project. And this was just based on snippets that we were showing him. So I think the first time we met with Matthew, we showed him some extracts of, like the research I'd been doing on Live and Let Die, which eventually became a really big story. The idea that, George Martin and the producers of the film, actually, it was just a misunderstanding. That was covered in our first volume, that they didn't want to drop Paul's vocal from Live and Let Die and replace it with a female vocal. It was actually a misunderstanding with the producers. But anyway, we showed Matthew a few snippets of the book. He really liked it. And then a few months later, we had, I think it was 4 or 5 publishers that were interested in taking the book. We eventually ended up on Day Street Books with our lovely editor, Carrie, who fully embraced the project and, has given us the artistic space and flexibility to deliver what we've delivered, really, which is 2 ridiculously big books, which I don't think a lot of other publishers would have entertained. Carrie's actually the editor for Ken Womack as well. She's doing both of the Mal Evans books. So you can see when you pick up the Mal Evans book, the first one that Ken Womack did, that's quite a meaty book as well. And I get the feeling that the second book, which I believe is coming out this year, is going to be even bigger than the first one. So yeah, that's really how it all came about. Really, it was as we said in the first biography, in the acknowledgements, it was a biography that happened completely by accident. And there we are, 10 years down the line. Allan and I are still trucking along, and hopefully, for 2 or 3 more books.
Right. Now, was this your first time writing? Because I know your background was research and film. Was Volume 1 your first book?
Yeah, so I mean, I've written for television, but writing for television is very different than writing long form. Television is just a series of cliches. The more cliches, the better. So it was an interesting process, adapting, writing, television scripts to writing long form. And really, Allan has to take an awful lot of credit for that. We used to have this little joke, which was that I'd pass him my chapters and run them through what we would call the Kozinator. And Allan would correct all of my terrible writing, grammatical errors, and everything like that. And so yeah, I really have to thank Allan for helping me kind of get up to speed on that front. But Allan wrote most of Volume 2, whereas Volume 1 I did write some of.
His writing is pretty good. I mean, I don't want to let him trash himself.
And for you, Allan, we know that's your thing. Author, journalist, critic. That's right down the middle what you're all about. And you did have, and I can never get the titles down and the number of books, but there were several Beatle books under your belt, as I mentioned at the top of the show, and also you've written classical music in addition to print, newspaper, and whatnot. Volume 1 of McCartney Legacy was the first book from you in how many years? What was the last one you were involved with? And were you looking to get back at the time, no pun intended, to writing a book as opposed to, say, articles or being on staff as a critic?
Um, well, I mean, I'd written books while doing that other stuff all through, and the last Beatles one I did was Got That Something, How the Beatles, I Want to Hold Your Hand Changed Everything, which was really just an ebook, and it was only like 25,000 words, which is like, a chapter intro for us now. Uh, and after that, I did a book about the Spoleto USA Festival. I can't remember when that came out. It was probably like 2015. Um, so yeah, I guess I hadn't really thought about whether I wanted to just do books, but now I think I just want to do books because this has been a lot of fun. This has been more fun than any of the other books I've done, probably. The Fiden book about the Beatles, which is now called From the Cavern to the Rooftop. I think I wrote in 19 days. Um, and it would have been less than that, except that I kept going through that big white Beatles scores book done by those Japanese guys, and with my guitar and just play through stuff. And it was just so much fun doing that. I'd turn the page and say, let's see what the next one feels like, because getting the feel of a song in your hand, especially using a book like that, which is a direct transcription, not just the chord symbols, really sort of helps give you an idea of the logic of how the music's constructed. So I did that with the McCartney stuff too, as we did these books. And that's actually for me a really fun way to write. I mean, if I were not writing about music, probably not sure what I would do, but this is the thing. So yeah.
But it's been a bit of a blessing, I think, for both of us that we've been part of a collaboration. I can't even imagine what it's like to be Mark Lewison right now, just kind of working on your own, working under a self-imposed deadline. The great thing for Alan and I is that we can debate, and we do debate constantly. So I'll write something and Alan will offer his thoughts on it. Alan will write something and I'll do the same to him. And every little detail in the book is scrutinized by two people. So while we're not perfect, we do get things wrong, and we know that there are typos in both books, and there are things that aren't quite right, but they've been run through two pairs of eyes and double checked and triple checked, and then they've been checked by our copy editor and our editor. So the list there is quite long. But from our perspective, what that also brings is just a huge amount of fun. The fact that we can have this constant open dialogue about this period of McCartney's life. It's just been a 10-year blast really for the two of us. It really has, whether it's talking on the telephone or just a constant stream of WhatsApp conversations about, a song or, one particular element of the narrative. But, like I said, being part of a duo working on a project like this has been invaluable, really.
Mm-hmm.
And there are things that both of us either notice or understand or think about something that the other hasn't. I mean, I when we were working on The Note You Never Wrote, I mean, I just could not make sense of that as a song. And I mentioned it to Adrian in a WhatsApp note, and he wrote back and said, no, it's this. And we went back and forth a few times, and it finally completely made sense to me. And I'm not sure that if I didn't have a collaborator, I would have really come to an understanding of that, because to me, it was just sort of a weird concept, but it does make sense. And
Yeah.
so, and the two of us have things like that, which, sometimes mine are just purely musical, that makes special sense to me, and I'll, convey it to Adrian, and just stuff like that. I mean, the back and forth has been really useful, totally apart from the division of actual labor, which has also been really useful. I mean, there's a huge amount of research involved in this. And if and Adrian's done really the lion's share of that, but I'm just lucky to have just amassed all this stuff over the years that I could throw into the research pot, and so it's been great. I think, I mean, all my other books have been really just single person books, but this is a great way to work.
I'm interested about the writing styles, though. How does that work? If you write a chapter, Alan, or even if something as small as a paragraph, Adrian has a big chunk. I imagine that has happened when then the pieces get fit together. How do you combine the writing styles so the reader doesn't detect a different person's writing? This is at this, how do you avoid?
That's what the Kozinator is that Adrian mentioned.
Yeah.
I mean, just to impose some sort of stylistic consistency, but basically it won't be like, we're each contributing 2 paragraphs here and 3 paragraphs there to a chapter. It'll be Adrian will say, I'd really like to write the chapter on whatever, because he feels particularly close to a project or a tour or whatever it is. And so he'll then send me the whole chapter, and I'll go through the whole chapter and,
Okay.
do the stylistic consistency. It's the tough thing about it is that since we do have different styles, we want it to be consistent, but I don't want to completely step on Adrian's style either, so there are things in there that I read and I say, yeah, that's Adrian, and I'm sure Adrian does that too. And
Yeah.
but it is generally speaking a consistently, written book.
It's interesting. When we first started writing separate chapters, I'd send stuff to Alan and he'd read them and he'd send me messages like, "Oh wow, I really like the way that you've done this." Like maybe there was I remember writing about the university tour, for example, and I know that part of England like the back of my hand because it's literally out there. It's a few miles away. So I know all those towns and cities. So I can describe them in a level of detail that Allan maybe couldn't. And then I'd read something Allan would write, and I'd say, I really like the way you've done it. And eventually, during the writing of that first volume, we kind of blended part of our styles. I'd say it was maybe 1/5 Sinclair, 4/5 Kozinn, or maybe a quarter Sinclair, 3/4 Kozinn that came together. And there is actually a point where our two styles joined in that first volume. And I remember Allan having to do a little work to kind of iron out that blend between the two. But it'd be interesting to see if any readers out there can find where that junction was, because it's a very definitive junction. But yeah, I think that we, in a strange way, during the writing of that first volume, kind of learnt quite a lot from one another in terms of the way that we approach storytelling and the way we interpret music, and a lot of things really we took from one another.
Ken, we have to try to find that point, like the Strawberry Fields Forever edit in the book, to see if there's one of them or two of them in there. Before we jump in and I hand it over to Ken, I'm curious about, was there any part of the McCartney story so far that you found yourself frustrated for the lack of ability of finding out the facts that you needed to properly tell a particular story of an event or something? Is there something that happened, but documentation was very hard, if not impossible, to track down to give some details on? If you understand what I'm asking.
Yeah. I don't think so yet. I mean, we're frustrated in the sense that what we would really like to do is just sort of truck over to MPL's archives and take every volume off the shelf and examine it closely, maybe photograph the pages and then set to work on it. So we don't have access to some things that we really would like in an ideal world, but I think we've been able to get around that pretty well so far.
I'm thinking something like along the lines, we know Wings went to New Orleans for X amount of time. And then doing the research and can't get the necessary documentation for whatever reason, which leaves a gaping hole in this section of the story. Did that type thing.
Yeah, I mean, I remember writing the story of Back to the Egg was frustrating. We had less available information for that album probably than most of the others. And frustratingly, there were things like, we spoke to one of the engineers, Tim Summerhays, about this, and when they were recording in the castle, they dated all of the tapes over a period of 3 days, but they were there for 3 weeks or something. So the available information for that period was frustrating. But really, what we did with those sessions, as we do when we're lacking information like that, is we reverse engineer the recording. So we take the bootleg recording that was from that period, and we look at what was on the final recording, and we analyze what was added during that time. That's what we do when we don't have the available paperwork. But in most cases, we've been very fortunate that we do have the available paperwork, so we can present it, exactly as it happened. But yeah, it would have been nice if the engineers had been a bit more fastidious during the recording of Back to the Egg. But to be fair to them, they were spread across 3 locations, between Scotland, the south of England and London.
All right. Ken, throw it over to you. My cat Beansy was able to make his contribution, thwap me in the head with his tail. So now we'll let you thwap us, Ken.
Okay. I could certainly tell in the case with Allan, there are moments there in the book where he starts talking about musically what's going on in certain songs, and where the bass line goes down to this note or moves to this chord, or we're having a diminished chord here. And, I love the fact that you add that in there. And sometimes you'll even make a reference to, well, Paul did the same thing on this song, or on a Beatles song. So I love that element that you add to it, but some people might consider that a little bit too geeky. Not everybody's going to understand. How do you determine, how much of that information you offer here in the book? Because you don't do too much of it, but I enjoy it, those few instances here and there when you do that.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of understand that not everybody has studied music theory. I have no idea why they haven't, but they haven't, and I accept that. Um, so, if you're talking about, first of all, you're doing a biography of a musician, and you're focusing on his work, uh, and you want to show how the music works, you kind of have to at some point say what it is that's happening in the music and hope that people will somehow understand it, or, if they don't know what a diminished chord is, you can look it up. When I was a kid, you had to go to a library or take a book off a shelf. Now you can sit at your computer and type diminished chord and get a pretty good explanation very quickly without even having to move.
Hmm.
So, I don't think it's too much to ask, and I think it's necessary, but I've tried to keep it to a dull roar, because I don't want people's eyes to glaze over with, huge long explanations of the technical stuff. And I'm also aware, I mean, this doesn't matter to me that much. I'm aware that, Paul is also not a music theory guy. But the fact that he's not a music theory guy doesn't mean that he isn't doing stuff that is interesting to people who are music theory people. He's doing it intuitively, and that in a way is even more interesting than doing it from, a schooled background. So I just want to explain how it works, and show, I mean, there's one point I think with I'm Carrying, where it's not really even music theory. It's just sort of guitarism in a way. I was playing through the thing while I was writing it, and just sort of noticed that, actually everything works with this little pattern. If you just slide your fingers down a couple of frets, you can get the first few chords that way. It's
Hmm.
not until like the fourth or fifth chord where you even have to change your position. And that's a way of writing that people do. And I just felt that it was important, or at least interesting, to point that out, but, try and keep it fairly concise. Because if I didn't keep it concise, I'd hear about it from Adrian, because Adrian represents he knows what he's doing musically too, but he sort of represents the average reader in that sense of like, look, you're going to put people asleep. So, and I take it seriously when he thinks I've done too much. So, which happens. So that I guess that's probably, we do it case by case.
Okay.
Some songs
I,
don't need much of it, and some songs do.
Yeah,
I
but
find
the
all of that fascinating. Hmm.
But the interesting thing is, how many other biographers have got the ability to do that, to pick up the guitar and analyze a song the way Allan can. So I'm not gonna put a brick wall up. If Allan wants to do that, I'm quite happy to encourage him to do more. But yeah, it's finding that balance between delivering a book that ticks all these different boxes for different readers, and delivering a book that's commercially appealing to your publisher. But those sections of the book are brilliant, and I always love reading them. It's like getting a magic set and them showing you how the magic works. That's very much kind of what Alan's doing there. It's kind of pulling back the curtain and showing how the McCartney magic works.
Right.
Yeah, those sections I always found fascinating to read. But yes, I must confess I did trim a couple of them back when
Hmm.
my eyes glazed over, as Alan said.
But I should point out that, when we signed the contract for the first book, I think Adrian's present to himself was a 12 string, and he's been in bands and he plays guitar, and it's
Mm.
it's not like he's not an educated, music listener, reader. So I should just point that out.
Maybe the two of you should form a duo. Yeah.
Transatlantic.
Yep. You'll be the, the new twins. Maybe. I'd like to talk about walking in the park with Eloise because a few years ago I interviewed Mike McCartney when the Begeer album was reissued. And we talked a little bit about that song, and I know that he said that he believed there were words written for it. And you do mention in the book that I think one of Paul's uncles wrote lyrics, but I didn't know if you found out any information about whether or not Paul's dad wrote any lyrics at all to the song, and if you
No.
could shed any light about that, because for Mike to say that to me, which was entirely new, I never heard there were words to "Walking in the Park with Eloise."
Yeah, you'd be surprised to hear that. I think just after Paul's bust in Japan, when he came back to England, I think it was probably when he was working on the Cold Cuts project. He pulled out of his back catalogue some songs that had no words, and words were written for them. Because somebody else we interviewed, I think it might have been Earl Oaken, who was the support act on the 79 tour, also had a go at writing some words for Eloise. And there were also words written for Hot as Sun, but that was issued as a single, wasn't it? Trying to remember which artist it was, like a theatre singer. She issued that as a single. So basically, in sometime in sort of mid 1980, Paul did get words written for several of his instrumentals, some of which we've never heard. And Eloise is definitely, one of those songs that we've never heard any of those words for. But it's very likely that somewhere in the archives there are maybe 2 or 3 attempts to write words for Eloise.
But from what I understood, I thought it was maybe Paul's father that wrote them, or someone in his family that wrote them.
No, I believe that we've heard that story about his uncle having tried to write some words for it. But certainly Jim never had a go at writing lyrics for that song that we're aware of, anyway.
And there never has been any proof that Paul's father wrote anything else other than that one song.
Apparently not.
All right. Also, there's a point in your book where you mentioned that Paul was on the phone with his father, Jim, and he was really upset that Angie McCartney was trying to be part of an after party after Wings played at the Empire Theater in Liverpool. Do you know anything at all about that? Because apparently they had an exchange, Paul and Jim was very upset with Paul.
Well, I think Angie got invited by someone in Paul's management team who saw her at the concert and assumed that she'd been invited. And I'm sure you've seen things like this happen in your own life. Someone invites someone who hadn't been invited, and I think it was just a misunderstanding that Paul got upset about. Yes.
Yeah, I think also by the sound of it, well, according to Angie, I think she was kind of persona non grata with a lot of the McCartney clan around that time because they had conflicting ideas of, how Jim's healthcare should be handled. Angie wanted to listen to Jim's wishes that he would stay at home and be cared for, in his own bed. Whereas I think some of the McCartney clan felt that he needed to be moved to, a specialist place where he could receive specialist care. So there was a conflict on that front. Not that Paul or Linda or anybody had a strong opinion on either side, but I can imagine that somebody in Paul's position was probably getting it in the ear from certain relatives that, Angie's not listening to what we want. But really, Angie was just fulfilling Jim's dying wishes, really, and being, a faithful and very loving wife. So yeah, it's a strange one, that really, that there would be such a strong reaction, but you can't help but get the feeling that maybe that strong reaction from Paul was because he was, hearing strong reactions from other members of his family about what was happening with Jim at the time.
Right. Um, One of the things that you really learn from reading your book is, and I know I've said this on the show before, that I think all four Beatles are insecure in their own ways, but Paul was really affected by criticism of his work, especially that one particular writer, Charles.
Or Murray.
Yeah, he was brutal when it came to Paul. And sometimes Paul is just very unsure of himself. It's one thing to write your own music and record it and think that what you're doing is really good, but you don't know how the public's going to react to it, especially music critics. But on the one hand, here's somebody who's having immense success throughout the 70s, and yet he could be so insecure at the same time, not knowing how the next record's going to do, the next single's going to do. And I think your book really illustrates these different sides of Paul, um, and how complicated a man he was. I mean, in some ways, it's easy to understand this, but he was very complicated. And I don't want to ramble on too much, but sometimes when it comes to like the Beatles, there's that whole period there where he's getting fed up with answering questions about the Beatles, and especially the Beatles reunion that was going to take place in 1976 from the promoter that was constantly mentioned in the press, Bill Sargent,
Mhm.
over and over and over again, while Paul has a number one album and a number one single, and the press is still hounding him about the Beatles. And yet at the same time, there's a moment in there, and I only picked it up once, where Paul's publicist even kind of instigated that he be asked a question about the Beatles. So it's kind of like on the one hand, he feels this way strongly and he wants to move on and progress and talk about Wings. And yet at the same time, there are moments when he wants to talk about the Beatles.
Yeah, he wanted to
So,
have it both ways a lot of the times, it seems. I mean, we had a memo from his manager to members of the press, sort of warning them not to talk about the Beatles. And, he had a whole bunch of rules. And in quite a number of instances, Paul would bring up the Beatles. And if the journalist didn't bring up the Beatles, there was one interview where he's saying, "So aren't you going to ask me about the Beatles?" You know, so it just, I guess, depends what sort of mood he's in. And, that and the insecurity thing are really just being human, And I think one of the things we're doing in this book is we're humanizing Paul. I mean, people may not seem not to understand that, just because you're a superstar doesn't mean you're not human with all of the insecurities and feelings that everybody has, you know? I mean, like on a much more mundane level, not being a superstar. Um, when I taught at NYU for 10 years, every year we'd get student evaluations, anonymous.
mm,
30 people in the class, 29 would say, this class was great, best class I ever took, blah, 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 blah. One guy, his lectures were boring. And I'd be, running around for a week saying, what do you mean my lectures were boring? And Paula would say, it's 1 out of 30. Why are you obsessed about that? Well, it's the same with it's not the same thing, but you see what I mean? It's similar. Paul gets a bad review and that sticks in his craw, but he's also getting a lot of good reviews and millions of people are going out and buying the record. And you would
mm,
think that that would be enough, but if you work the way he works to make these records, and a song is an expression of himself, he's putting himself out there,
mm,
and it's being, criticized by someone else who may or may not even quite understand what it is. I mean, you see some of the reviews that we quoted that don't really seem to know what's going on. Um,
mm,
and that's going to bother him, and it's going to, and especially if it's aggressively negative, like Charles Shaar Murray's review was.
mm,
um, it's going to upset him. It's going to hurt him because it's out there for the public to read just the same as the record is, you know? And people pick it up and they start quoting it, and it gets, takes on a life of its own, and he's not happy with that kind of thing, and it's understandable.
Yeah, I think the thing he disliked the most about the Charles Shaw Murray review of Venus and Mars was that it was kind of personal when you read it, and also it was 2 whole pages of NME. This isn't just a small review. Your normal album review will just be maybe a quarter of a page for a Paul album. This was 2 whole pages,
Mm.
and the first half of it was just Charles Shaw Murray talking about how much he disliked the experience of visiting MPL's offices. And then, he quoted some of the conversation he'd had with Paul verbatim, including the ums and the ers and everything that a journalist would normally take out. So it felt as if it was a personal attack, really, that review. I think that's why he was so incensed by it. And it wasn't just a slant on him. It was kind of, it was, Linda was there too, and there were comments about Linda in the review. And yeah, it just left a very bad taste in his mouth. And as he said at the time, this is the interesting thing when you pick through all these old interviews and music papers, you find all this stuff out. He then talks, a couple of months later about how he didn't buy NME for a very long time after having read that review of Venus and Mars. And that, like I say, that's the why it's so important for Allan and I when we're doing this project to go back to the source, to go back to that period, because you just don't find those details out by clicking on the internet and searching for things. You have to go and physically pluck those journals out of an archive like the British Library.
Yeah.
And that's why these books take so long to write. But we do like to think that that's why you get this kind of fly on the wall feel when you're reading the books, is because we spent so much time sourcing these little details that like you say do give a very good insight into that kind of very insecure personality that Paul does have at times.
Yeah. I mean, I think all of us who have been in the public eye can understand and relate to what Paul's going through there. I mean, if you've been around long enough, you can't please everybody no matter how hard you try. But Paul's had this experience from the Beatles, and he would like to bring up something like From Me to You wasn't well received. It was a step down after Please Please Me. So he had that experience even in the Beatles. There was criticism. So it might
Let's
be a little surprising with all that experience of having criticism in the past that he would be ultra sensitive.
When he did his ballet in around 2010, another reporter at the Times interviewed him, and I was standing by his desk towards the end of the interview, and I said, "So, how did it go?" And he said, "Well, it was interesting." And I said, "Did he happen to mention that the New York Times panned Sergeant Pepper?" And he said, "He did." Like as if that was a surprise. But yeah, he holds on to these things. Well, that's okay.
But then, like you say, anybody who puts anything out there, like our books, we will read reviews of our books and they'll say lots of glowing and positive things. And then we'll get to the end and we've only been given 6 out of 10 or whatever. And you think, well, you said all these really nice things. Why haven't you given us a higher score? So we experience the same thing ourselves on a micro level. But I suppose when you're like Paul and you're, that famous, it's kind of a very different level of insecurity start to creep in. I think a lot of it, plays or comes back to that whole me and him thing that we explored in volume 1. That me is insecure. Him is this, great pop star with a huge ego who can walk out on the stage and deliver a concert in front of 120,000 people, and I think that, a lot of performers do, split their personality in that way. I don't think it's unique to Paul. I was watching a documentary, in fact, yesterday about Avicii, the Swedish sort of pop star who committed suicide, and a lot of people said that of him, that he had that kind of me and him thing going on, that duality. So I think it's very common amongst famous people.
Yeah. Um, One thing that I picked up as far as the Wings Over America tour, um, it kind of reminded me a little bit going back to the Beatles. Brian Epstein didn't want to book the Beatles early on when they toured America in very big venues at all. When Sid Bernstein approached him with Shea Stadium in 1964, he was afraid that they wouldn't sell out. So when Wings toured America in 1976, most of the venues they played at was, at probably no more than 20,000 seat, like Madison Square Garden. But then you got Seattle Kingdom, which was like 54,000. What made him want to? Because I think he was really trying to be careful there, because it would be embarrassing if he didn't sell out on certain shows. Why would he play, a stadium that big and risk it? Because, if he didn't sell out, it would make big waves in the media, big headlines.
That's true. I think in that case, I mean, we don't know anything about what went into his decision for that, but I think it was a new venue,
Hmm.
and that in itself had a certain appeal. And you can always paper a house if you have to. He probably had a sense that he would sell pretty well. Um, and so, well, he did.
No, you don't think he was really trying to be careful in 76, his first tour of America, not picking the biggest?
Right. He was probably trying to be careful, but I don't know. I don't know why it's Kingdom specifically, but it turned out not to have been a bad decision.
Yeah, you get the feeling that a lot of those decisions were made for him as well. Like we talk in the New Orleans chapter that he went and visited the New Orleans Dome. I can't remember what the name of it was at the time, but they didn't play there. So you get the feeling that a lot of those decisions are made by promoters and tour managers, and they're based on logistics of kind of getting from one venue to the next venue within 24 hours. And like Allan said, the King Dome was a new venue at the time, so they probably had a fairly good idea that, with a big stellar name like McCartney, that they could sell out that place, with it being a new venue. And the promoters would probably have given the Eastmans reassurances that, if ticket sales were looking like they were going to be low, that they had ways of, like Allan says, papering, and filling that venue.
Yeah. Weren't there a few shows they didn't sell out?
I think it was maybe only one, or yeah. There's certainly something we know in the second book about one venue where the sales were slightly down. I can't
Hmm.
remember off the top of my head, but I think that was something to do with the conflict with another promoter. It was really nothing to do with Paul's name.
Mhm.
Okay. I'll pass you back to Darren.
Um, in reading this second volume, I get the impression that for most of the 70s, there was and I think I mentioned this in our last show last week. There's a little bit of a dysfunction in Wings. And it seemed to be there was a lot of work keeping the band clicking on all cylinders. And then this comes to a point where after Back to the Egg comes out in 1979, and I don't remember specifics, but I remember coming across a section where you talk about, for lack of a better way of putting it, the wind was coming out of McCartney's sails when it came to Wings. The luster was coming off the band. The presence of the band, being in the band, um, was beginning to, um, it didn't mean as much maybe to Paul. And I'm going back and I'm thinking, well, firing a Jeff Britton, and then you get Jimmy McCullough, and Jimmy's very volatile individual, and managing Jimmy's personality. Joe English is more subtle, but there's a moodiness there. There's both of them are dealing with personal issues, substance abuse. Um, Maybe Joe is more easy to get along with, but it also seems like he needed pampering at times. Whereas Jimmy would be hanging off you know, a chandelier somewhere, getting in trouble there. And then, Back to the Egg comes out. Even London Town sales showed a slight dip. And then Back to the Egg really showed that. All of that going on there. And then somewhere in 79, again, I come across in your book, in the book, um, that Wings was starting to become work for Paul. Did I read into that?
No,
Again,
I
probably
think
a
you're.
part I skimmed
Hmm.
past, but
I think you're right. Yeah, but I guess there's a couple of things going on there, really. That this isn't the first time for Paul. He's been here before, and we saw how hard he fought to try and keep the Beatles together. And now he's experiencing the same thing with Wings, really, 10 years on. And I suppose it's kind of how much fight does he have left in him? And when Joe and Jimmy left, it was really Denny who brought Wings back together. Denny recruited Steve and Lawrence. It wasn't down to Paul. Paul gave them the big Macca thumbs up, but he didn't recruit them. He had no part to play in recruiting them at all. Um, yeah, and I think also, Paul Paul consistently says in interviews that when he formed Wings, he says two things really, which is one, because he wanted to keep on singing, because your voice is an instrument and you've got to keep using it or you'll lose it. And the other thing was that he wanted to prove that he could do it again. And really, by the time that we've got to the late 70s, he's kind of proved to the world that he can do it again. He's had big success across the board with singles and albums, particularly in America. He's had a big sellout tour in America. So really, I think by the time we get to London Town and Back to the Egg, yeah, maybe his appetite and his fight is what he's lacking, really. It's not his appetite to make music, it's his appetite to try and keep this thing together that he's made, that is Wings. And the same thing happened with the Beatles. He was the one who was walking the hillsides in June, July of 1970, debating whether or not he should sue the other Beatles to disband, to break their business ties, because he'd fought so hard to keep the Beatles together. So yeah, you get the feeling that he was going through a similar thought process really when it came to Wings around that time.
There might have been another couple of things too. Um, One is that by the end of the 75, 76 tour, Linda was hankering to get back to Scotland and, saying overtly in press interviews, I'd be perfectly happy never touring again. And she went in 79, and as we know, she'll be going out in volume 3 and 4 as well. But she wanted to just sort of stop doing it. She found that being on stage was a little bit soul killing, to her. Um, Not obviously to Paul, I mean, Paul lived for that. Linda didn't live for it. She did it because Paul wanted her to do it, with him. Um, and the second thing is that having come through that tour, it's very possible that with that tour, and particularly the Wings Over America part of it, Paul accomplished what he wanted to do when he formed Wings in the first place. He wanted to go back out and conquer the world the way the Beatles had, and he had now done it. He'd done Australia. He hadn't done Japan, but he had done the US and all of Europe pretty much. And he'd made his point. And maybe that also sort of contributed towards, why he was slow to replace Joe and Jimmy when they left, whereas Denny was always saying, I hate recording. I don't want to sit around the studio. I want to go out on tour. And so he, as Adrian said, he recruited Steve and Lawrence. Paul could have said no if he didn't want to. I mean, he was obviously impressed with them when they had their little auditions with him, but I think maybe he had already just sort of done what he wanted to do with a band, and it just took him a while, a few more years to realize that that was the case.
All right. So then I'm sorry. We want to say something, Ken?
Yeah. If that's so, he toured with Wings,
in
the UK
79,
tour in 79,
right?
and he was going to play in Japan. And from what I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, didn't he have plans of going back to America and touring?
Yeah, I mean, I think 1980 would have been, well, had things turned out differently, would have been split between filming the or doing the film project with Willie Russell, the band on the run, and doing more touring. But there were no set in stone plans to tour America in 1980.
Hmm.
The idea was that they were going to come back to England after Japan and evaluate what to do next. Um, but yeah, no, I see what you're saying. You know, he still toured with Wings, but you know, when we spoke to Lawrence and Steve, you know, they said they didn't really rehearse as much as they did in '76, and you get the feeling that was he touring through contractual obligation, or was he touring through desire? When Linda, came back from the '76 tour, and she said something along the lines of every time you go on stage, you lose a little piece of yourself. I mean, that's a pretty profound statement to make off the back of a tour. You'd think that being on stage in front of 20,000 fans would be quite soul enriching, but for Linda, it was kind of becoming a bit soul sapping. So I think that, there were probably some, conflicts going on, you know, within the McCartney household about, desires to tour. And maybe that was, like Alan said, something that was pulling back on Paul. But at the same time, he's got Columbia, his new record label, saying, you need to get out there and promote this album. We need to sell it. So, so he's fulfilling his contractual obligation by doing that. But I don't think his desire to tour was as strong in '79 as it was in '76, certainly. You can
Now,
just tell. You can just. I was just going to say, you can just tell by the amount of press he did as well. He did so much more press leading up to the '75, '76 tour than '79. I mean, he was almost like non-existent in the press, really. And yeah, it was very noticeably from our perspective when we were researching it.
now, uh, to jump off that, part of the book that I haven't yet read is the McCartney II home sessions, which come right out of Back to the Egg. Um, can you shed some light on why Paul decided to kind of retreat uh, to his home, work alone for the first time in years? Was this related to how he felt about being in the band? Did he want to go off on his own and do something? Why did he commit time in mid 79 to what became McCartney 2, but at the time was just some solo messing around?
I think, well, there's a couple of different things going on there, and I'll cover the first one, then I'll pass you to Alan because really he wrote that whole chapter expertly, and when I read it, it blew my mind. But I think the initial motivation was because he'd moved his family to their cottage in Sussex. They'd moved to Waterfall Cottage, and about a year or so after that, he acquired another farm and had somebody install a home studio equipment there. So I think the primary kind of motivation was that he was now living in Sussex in the middle of nowhere, and he just happened to have a home studio at his disposal. So that's why he started to tinker around. But I'll let Alan talk about the actual sessions because he was the one that really did all the work of chronicling them.
I think it's a lot what Adrian said, but also uh, if you think about it, in between every album, he's up in Scotland working on demos. He had the Studer 4-track since the McCartney days, the first album, McCartney. And now he just sort of expanded it, and he had all of these synthesizers that he'd been buying for Linda largely, and wanted to sort of play with those, see what they could do. It wasn't something that was normally his wheelhouse, but I think he felt that he wanted to get familiar with them, especially also because out in the wider music world, there were a lot of other people getting familiar with them. Electronica was beginning to, be heard, and as a force alongside, punk, which was fading out, and disco was fading in, and but there's also this electronic thing that, in a certain way, is part of disco too. And I think he just wanted to see, to some degree, how these things work. To some degree, it was also back to his normal demo making thing, except that he didn't want to do it the usual way, because one of the things Paul likes to do is do something different. you know, just as a way of coming up with fresh ideas, just not do it the way he's always done it. So instead of walking into the studio with a song all prepped and ready to go, he just went in, said, "Okay, let's see if I get a beat," and then add a bass line, and then and these pieces began to sort of form themselves almost as if he's doing a jam one line at a time by himself. And then towards the end of it, I think he was running out of ideas, and he began to do more conventional songs in a lot of cases, but in things like Wonderful Christmas Time, because he, while doing this sort of glorified demo project, which I think is what he originally sort of thought it was, because he said specifically, "I went in to not make an album," you know? Um, it occurred to him as well, okay, it's July, Christmas is going to be coming soon enough, and I want that Christmas number one that is so important to British people. And so that became sort of a more formal song, and there were a few others on that album that are more conventional songs, but all the things that he started out with were much more experimental, um, inspired by what he heard on the radio that morning. There's some semi-classical stuff that seems to be inspired by Bach. And other things, and just sort of go in, he'd have Twiggy and her boyfriend over for dinner. They'd be talking about something, and then just go into the studio and lay down sort of a whimsical track, about what they're talking about. So I think he did it not necessarily to escape Wings, but just to do something different, just as sort of like a gigantic palate cleanser. I mean, on some subconscious level, he might have been doing it to escape Wings. Who knows? There are lots of reasons people do things, and they're not always apparent to them as they're doing it. But I think a lot of these things fed into why he did McCartney II, what became McCartney II.
It's interesting you said that some of the cuts on the album were developed in a more conventional way. And when we spoke to Steve Holly, Steve said to us when he visited Paul that summer that Paul asked him to try redoing the drums for Wonderful Christmas Time. But he said that he couldn't do them any better than what Paul had already done. So I think what's on the record is still all Paul. So he must have been viewing that as a single, even in kind of July, August. So I think Alan's absolutely right that, when he said that Paul was definitely chasing that Christmas number one spot, which is very important to us Brits, but apparently not to you Americans.
Not really, no.
Can I ask, can I ask something here? Do you think Paul knew when he recorded McCartney II that it was going to be released as a commercial album? Because the story he usually tells is, I played it for a few friends and they said to me, I guess that's your next album. And then Paul thought, I guess it is.
Which is sort of where I was going, Ken.
Oh,
Had
sorry.
if he doesn't get arrested in Japan and the Japanese tour takes place as planned, and then they were going to, as you mentioned, Adrian, sit down and assess what's next. Does the McCartney II album ever come out?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, he was sending copies of that album to people in late 79.
Oh, so it
So
was probably going to happen anyway.
yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, people like Chris Thomas told us that he received a copy. And I think we talked about that in part one of your podcast, actually, about this book. Chris Thomas was told He was sent a copy of the album, and it was the double LP. And the one note that Paul gave him was, "Don't tell me this isn't a double LP." So so yeah, yeah, we know of other people who were also sent, copies of test pressings. So EMI were definitely gearing up, certainly on this side of the Atlantic, to put that album out.
And
Like with the original McCartney album, I think he started it not knowing if it was going to be an album, and saying overtly that it's not going to be an album. But a little way into it, he began to think, this is actually pretty good. I could put this out. And so he began thinking of it that way. And I think you can tell as the sessions go on that it gets where more conventional song forms start coming in as well. You can see that he's beginning to think that way about this stuff.
what was Columbia Records' reaction coming out of Back to the Egg? They signed McCartney. Essentially, they signed the band Wings, and Back to the Egg comes out. It doesn't perform as they would like. And Paul's back with McCartney II, which I know today I love McCartney II, but when it came out, I was 15 years old. I was not ready for what McCartney II had to offer, especially after the crunchier Back to the Egg. And I think I sat after listening to McCartney II with my mouth hanging open for hours. Like, what did I just listen to? Bogey me? Huh? What was it? Wait a minute. I must have fallen asleep. Let me play it again. I mean, Columbia Records reaction. Do you get into that? Actually, no. Yeah, no. You wouldn't have gotten into that yet because the book ends.
Haven't released it yet.
Yeah. I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. All right. Now that I've gone ahead of myself, do you have any information? I mean, what was Columbia at this point? Then we'll back to the era we should be in. To now, oh, it gives us back to the A, now McCartney II.
Yeah, I think that Columbia certainly were unhappy that Paul didn't promote Back to the Egg, but it wasn't a chart topper in the States, Back to the Egg. But I think if you look at the sales records, don't they still claim that it was a platinum record, Back to the Egg?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm
So
sure there's many artists. The majority of artists would kill to have an album
yeah,
sell
so I mean,
well as Back to the Egg, but
so it's still sold well, but yeah, I can certainly imagine that when McCartney 2, landed on their desks, that it raised an eyebrow or two, uh, and certainly Tug of War was more the direction they were hoping Paul's music might go in. Um, and certainly that it ended up delivering what they were hoping for. Really, it was the golden egg for them, wasn't it? It was Tug of War.
right. So I kind of went off I just realized now I kind of fell off the cliff here into volume 3. So let me climb back back up onto into volume 2. And how close was there? And I think I know what the answer is. How close was a Beatle reunion at the time of the Kampuchea shows in late December '79? Because I remember, again, I'm a kid. I'm not even, that's before I turned 15, before I'd fallen off the cliff. I remember hearing a lot on the radio that was sounding like the planets were aligning today. Wings are playing a concert, a benefit concert in England today. And you know how rumors go, they were getting like, John was seen on that part of the world today. And how close, if at all, was something cooking at the end of December '79?
Not that close. A little close, maybe. I mean, George Harrison was interested in the whole Kurt Waldheim thing. I mean, he had been approached by the fake person who was claiming to be representing Waldheim, and he didn't dismiss it out of hand. Um, but in the end, he didn't really volunteer to do anything as Paul did, to do something with Wings. And Paul talked about wanting to invite the others to come to the show, see what would happen. But then in the end, I think he admitted that he didn't ask them to come. He might have even asked them not to. I'm not sure exactly how far he went, but I think, there were a lot of rumors and it sounded like it might be close, but I don't think it was really ever that close. You know, John was in New York. He wasn't in that part of the world. So uh, I just don't think it really was any
Yeah.
closer than any of the other reunions.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I think a lot of that hype surrounding those concerts came from the promoters, and I think in even one instance it came from Paul's own manager. Came out and made some statement to the press that was really misleading. So I think probably what you were hearing over in the States was a consequence of just a lot of spin that was being put probably to sell tickets, by UK promoters. Although I think by that stage it was probably long sold out. So I don't know why they were trying to hype it.
Yeah, I can't remember specifics now. It's too many years, but I do remember that there was definitely a loud buzz on the radio. One day right before New Year's '79, and something was brewing. Um, I don't recall if I at that point put two and two together. Oh, Wings are touring. I probably didn't. If I knew it, it didn't mean much to me because it was happening in another part of the world, or I'm not even sure if I knew what Kampuchea was yet at that point, but just that there was an event. And part of this event stuff starting to come together here. Um, but anyway, you close the book out at the point when Paul opens his suitcase in the airport in Japan, and whoops, how'd that get in there? And so you have these interviews from Lawrence Juber, who I think was standing right next to Paul when they were stopped, and everyone involved in the whole scenario. And the funny question is, but it bears me asking it again, what was he thinking? What was happening? Who packed? Who, what was, did you remember the car keys? Hurry up, we're going to miss the plane. 1 second, I forgot my shoes. Oh, and let me grab this.
8 ounces. Grab these 8 ounces of dough. Yeah.
What,
I think the best the best I can suggest is what we quote someone. I think it was Bob Gruen asked John Lennon at one point, why? What was he thinking? And John said, well, he is just used to not having his baggage checked because people didn't check the Beatles' bags. It just didn't happen. And so he just probably didn't believe that it was going to happen. I mean, it sounds absurd to say that, especially since in 1975 he was supposed to go to Japan, got his visas, and then his visas were revoked because the Japanese government didn't want him in because he had two pot busts in Scotland and Sweden, I think. So you would think that just prudence would, have taken over, but he just, I guess, felt that he was untouchable.
Yeah, unfortunately, that something like that leads to a lot of speculation, doesn't it? It's kind of then people ask the question, did Paul do it on purpose because he wanted Wings to be over? Or did he do it on purpose because the Japanese authorities revoked his visa in 75? But I think really what it boils down to, and I think it's probably one of the final quotes in our book, really, is that Paul just says something like, he did it because he was a dumb thing to do. Like Allan said, he thought nobody's going to check my bag. And if him and Linda had scored, weed as killer as, what everybody else has made out, then maybe it was that killer that they just wanted to take it with them. Maybe the answer is as simple as that. But the thing is, with with a story like this that it's very easy to read more into it and add those extra layers of context and subtext and blow it into something much bigger than it actually is. But maybe it really was just a Beatle doing something really stupid.
Yeah, I don't buy the theory that he did it because he wanted to break up Wings, because, there are ways you can do that without having to spend a few nights in jail, like just calling up everyone and saying, maybe let's not do this anymore. Um, and also he didn't break up Wings as soon as he got back to England. If that was his intention, then, there was his opportunity, but he kept it going for another year plus. So, so that doesn't work for me. I read that all the time, and I just don't even understand how such an illogical argument can be made.
Hmm.
Ken?
It could very well be that the end of Wings is a little bit more complicated
Mhm.
than we're aware of. I mean, I've heard when it came to Tug of War, George Martin didn't want it to be a Wings album, and
Mhm.
so there's that. If the primary purpose of Wings was to be a vehicle for Paul to tour with, and Linda didn't want to tour anymore, why bother?
Right.
And yet she was there in '79 with Wings touring. Um, and maybe Paul was just getting tired, as much as I'm sure he admired how talented Lawrence and Steve are in the band. Just always getting tired of having to pick up the pieces again with the group. Um,
But
I
there,
don't know if there's any part of him that thought, well, now I'm going to start my solo career, in 1980 or whatever. I don't know.
but as Alan said previously, in part one of this discussion of our book, this is probably the most stable Wings has ever been in 1979. So why would Paul want to see that very stable, very productive, um, very kind of level version of Wings implode? It just doesn't seem logical to me. But I can understand why fans like to have these fan theories, and you can read things into events. But I personally, I don't really buy that idea that he purposefully hid a bag of grass in his suitcase so that he would get busted so that Wings would be no more. Um, because if that was the case, then surely he would have just, stopped all activity with Wings when he got back from Japan, which he didn't do. So,
And he would be taking a very big chance there because the Japanese authorities are so strict, you know.
Yeah.
There was no guarantee that he was going to be let out of jail so soon.
Right. That could have been 7 years.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. That was what, 10 days?
Something like that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Do you I know this wouldn't be in the book, but is his time in prison and the experience documented?
Yeah, it's something we'll explore a little more
Agree, right.
in the next volume. Uh, you know, as Alan's mentioned before, we had this kind of back and forth over where to end the book, and Alan wanted to have Paul on a jet home after the Japanese bust, like the happy ending. But I just thought, well, we need to explore his experience in prison, and not just Paul's experience in prison, kind of everything else that was going on around him. What happened to his entourage, what happened with Linda, when did the Eastmans get involved, how was he sprung from jail so quickly? So I felt like that was something we really need to savor at the start of volume 3, and I think it's going to make a really delicious first chapter for volume 3. Seeing Paul get out of prison and eventually back in London with his tail between his legs, explaining himself to the world press, yet again, saying things like, I'm never going to smoke pot again in my life, all the classic McCartney statements that you get after a drug bust. But yeah, I think it's going to make a really great start to volume 3.
I
I,
remember late night television joking about almost like the saintly Paul McCartney got arrested for what? Paul McCartney's in jail? Probably was the Tonight Show or something. A just very, very, very faint memory of that happening. Ken, did you have something else?
Yeah, I was going to ask, we all know that Paul rarely says anything negative about people publicly. He's a master at being very diplomatic. And there was a quote I remember from Linda where she said Wings weren't really great musicians, you know, that that Paul could have done better, than to have Wings. I would imagine the other musicians in Wings would be furious because here's someone that was untrained as a musician and she was in the band because Paul wanted her there. And she really fulfilled her role, you know. She filled out the whole sound of Wings with harmonies, and she did her part with all the keyboard work that she did. But do you think that maybe, because Linda is far more outspoken than Paul was, that Paul might have used Linda as a mouthpiece for the way that he really felt?
Yeah, I remember reading that. Yeah, it
Ah,
was one of those retrospectives. And she even said that I think even when Denny Sywell and Henry McCulloch left the group, I think she said something pretty derogatory about the two of them as well,
hmm.
and said that we can do better. And you just think you don't mean those words, Linda. It's almost like she was saying them in some way to send a message to those guys that we've moved on and we don't need you anymore. We're bigger than you are. We're going to rise above it. I think, but it's interesting what you're saying there. Was she the mouthpiece for Paul? I suppose they did share an awful lot of views, and Paul is very diplomatic, and like you say, certainly she was the outspoken one. Um, but I'm not entirely convinced that Paul shared all of the things that all the views that came out of Linda's mouth. She was quite a fiery individual, and yeah, I don't think Paul would have said those words about someone like Denny Sywell. He was just such a phenomenal drummer.
Oh, I think all the members of Wings are great musicians.
Yeah, but I think that there was the argument, wasn't there, that and this is the argument that George Martin made with Tug of War, which is that Wings was a good touring band, but when you're an artist as big as Paul McCartney, you can just invite whoever you want into the studio. So, if you want to do a certain, you want to get a certain type of sound, you just bring in a musician, or a session musician or a superstar who fulfills that particular sound, as Paul did with Tug of War. So I can kind of understand really where George was going with that, which is, why use the same band when you can have your pick of the bunch, anybody. But at the same time, I think it's a bit of a put down really to say that musicians as talented as Lawrence and Steve couldn't fulfill any of the sounds on Tug of War.
No, I love all the different lineups of Wings.
Mm.
I think it made them more fascinating as a group. The differences between all the different, fourth and fifth members. They all added something different than the previous band did. So, yeah. And another thing that I find interesting about Wings in talking about the middle period there is that what the members of Wings, the other members would say to the press, might not have been how they really felt, because you hear so much about Jimmy didn't like the fact that Paul always wanted him to play the same way every song live, everything like that. And yet he'll talk about how much he enjoyed making Wings at the Speed of Sound a lot, more so than Venus and Mars. But he's not really all that negative when it comes to Paul publicly. Maybe he's just being careful. Um, and Denny as well. I mean, one thing I found really interesting is that Denny and Jimmy were similar in that they preferred going out live,
Mhm.
and they found being in the studio boring. Um, so I could see how those two would get along better, certainly more so than with Joe English. Um, Joe English actually said it's a good thing that we don't have contracts. Why would that be something that a musician would would want to say they'd want some kind of security, you would think.
I think
What?
that I was just
Yeah.
going to say, Ken, on that point of kind of, wanting to be on the road, Jimmy and Denny, I think there's probably two things there really, which is that, when you're in the studio with Paul and Paul's the one producing the record and really calling the shots, they would have spent an awful lot of time just kind of sitting in the background, smoking and sipping on beers and reading newspapers. It must have been quite monotonous at times, as exciting as fans must think how great it would be being in the studio when you're there day in, day out. And in a lot of cases, just being told what to play, that probably became quite boring. But also being on tour, really kind of fitted their lifestyles that they both enjoyed partying and going out and you know chasing girls. So I think that that certainly those two things made being on the road more appealing than being in the studio.
Mm. It's just interesting how what they'll tell the press is one thing and how they really feel inside could be something completely different.
Yeah. But also, in the book we do cover a memo that was sent out, and I think this was in around about 1974, when I think it was Denny did an interview and said some, quite controversial things to the press. That they were, every member of MPL and every member of the band was sent this memo, basically, telling them that they needed to run everything that they said past Paul and Linda or past Brian Brolly before they said it. So you just kind of think, well, there's no wonder why they were all just kind of towing the party line when they were doing press interviews and saying what was expected of them if they were getting slapped on the wrist when they said something controversial. And certainly, I've read every interview that was done by every member of that band, be it in the newspapers, magazines, or music press throughout the whole of the 1970s. And you're absolutely right. It's so rare that any one of a member of that band says anything controversial or derogatory of Paul or Wings, really. They tend to say overwhelmingly positive things, other than complaining about not being on the road often enough.
Um, well, I've got some harsh words coming from Joe English on Linda that's in the book. Um, he said, Linda is a nice chick and I really like her, but let's face it, she can't play and she can't sing. And Denny Lane can sing, but he tends to sing off key. I mean, that would Paul and Linda would let that go out.
Well, I think you also have to look at the context of a comment like that, because if you look at the Wings Over America album, for example, they had to redo a lot of the backing vocals on that. So they would have listened to each of those microphones in isolation in the studio. So, if he's singing, if Joe is saying that Denny's singing out of key, it's because he's heard it. And if he's saying that Linda's singing out of key, it's because he's heard it. He was there in the studio when they were playing back the 16 track tapes of every Wings Over America concert.
Mm.
So I suppose, when a journalist, when he makes a comment like that to a journalist, it sounds really harsh, but actually there's probably some validity in what he's saying in that occasionally they do sing off key. I mean, I think every singer sings off key. I'm sure if we were to listen back to the concerts Paul gave at the end of last year and listen to every isolated microphone, you'd hear every single one of the band at some point was singing off key. But yeah, well, I think when you read those comments in isolation, him saying that Linda's not a great musician, it does sound a little harsh. But she wasn't a trained musician, so. And she would raise her hands in the air herself and say that she wasn't a trained musician.
But still, you were saying that the McCartneys wouldn't want this. They wouldn't want other members of Wings to say this publicly to a journalist.
Hmm.
So weren't they kind of trying to control what the other members of Wings would say? And if so, how could, Joe get away with saying something like that?
We don't know what their private response to him was afterwards. He might have got slapped on the wrist one way or another, or just told not to. But, I think Paul probably also understood that, under certain circumstances, people say things in interviews that they're not supposed to. It just happens. And I think he, wouldn't have been happy about it, but I don't think it would have been the end of the world. I mean, there were some things, there were some interviews we have in the book too, where Jimmy is out of sorts and is, not talking about Paul or Linda particularly, but just about how, boring he finds recording, all that kind of stuff. In the same way, you don't think Paul would want that out too, because that
Hmm.
feeds into, the next critic who picks up the album. He can say, well, the players are bored doing it, no wonder it sounds so. But apart from that one memo, we don't have a lot of evidence of what how they tried to control them or anything like that. The other thing I want to point out is that uh, even after they left the band, most of the people who did leave the band, you still don't you see people sometimes saying, yeah, Linda wasn't a great musician, and who's going to argue with that? But you don't see people trashing Paul as a musician, or even as a band leader or anything. You don't get a lot of, you don't see much from Jimmy, for instance, um, you know, talking about issues he had with Paul. Even after he left, he did sort of toe the line. Yeah, I just wanted to go out and play with the small faces. You know,
Hmm.
so and I kind of think that once they're out of the band, they could have they could have talked trash about Paul if they really felt that strongly about it, but I don't think any of them did. I really don't. I think the people who worked with him, even after leaving the band under difficult circumstances, still had a lot of respect for him as a musician. Someone like Henry might have had a problem with, being told what to play, all that stuff, and he would say that, but none of them really said really harsh stuff about what it was like working with them.
Hmm. Okay. Could you clear up? I know in the book, you mentioned that With a Little Luck was a co-write with Denny Lane, and I think Famous Groupies was too. But do you have any kind of proof that Denny Lane helped write those songs?
Yeah, I mean, all that information came from period interviews. So they did a lot of press when London Town came out, and they actually talked through what it was that they wrote together. So that information comes from those interviews at in 19 would have been 78 when that was released, right? Yeah. So yeah,
Because
that's where that information comes from. Yeah.
it just says McCartney for those two songs.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting, that was the most productive the two of them ever were when they were working on the material for London Town. A lot of those were co-writes that they polished off together the summer before, in the summer of in fact no, it was the summer of 76, wasn't it, when they got back from the American tour. They worked on that material together.
Hmm.
Um so yeah, but yeah, as is often the case, a lot of them were just down as McCartney.
Okay.
But
It's
then
also
I guess if Paul had had his way, Mull of Kintyre would have just gone down as McCartney. But he did share the credit with Denny when it was issued, and subsequently he's had the credit signed over to him, hasn't he now? So it's just McCartney again. But when that was issued, it was McCartney Lane.
I thought it always said McCartney Lane, even today.
No, there was some monies exchanged, and
Then he sold
he
his
sold it. Mm,
song to Paul.
mm.
But when that happens, does that mean now um, the songwriting credit's going to change?
I'd have to check the latest release of Mull of Kintyre, which we don't have because it's not been reissued in some time to check. In fact, it would be in Paul's book, yeah, in the lyrics. If you check in there, you'll see the definitive answer. That was the last time it was credited. If it's credited back to McCartney or McCartney Lane, but certainly he owns the full copyright for that song now, because Denny sold it to Paul. I'm not sure about the credit.
We've swung back to the London town period, and I have one final question I have about this era, and that was the decision to record in the Virgin Islands, and not they were there for several weeks, 2 or 3 weeks. And again, another section of the book that I've yet to really sink my teeth into, but I'm looking forward to reading about what that experience was like. Can you put that in a bit of a nutshell? Wings recording on, first of all, logistically, I would think it would have. I remember when Jeff Emmerich's book came out, I interviewed Jeff for WFUV, and damned if I remember his answer, but I asked him about the logistics of how are you able to record equipment or get equipment on, get it to function, and the salt water and the salt in the air and the boat moving. And I know I'd be hanging over the side of the boat for a while throwing up when the boats are doing this. I mean, talk about the water wings period, which also was going to be the working title, I think, at one point, or was the working title.
It's not, well, okay, it is unusual. I was going to say it's not that unusual, but the thing is that they did this because Denny had been to a Rod Stewart recording session that was on a boat. And he wanted to record Holidays on a boat. And so this was just in the air, something they wanted to do. And when the Next Wings thing came up, it just seemed a nice idea to go to the Virgin Islands and go on a boat instead of being cooped up in Abbey Road in London. And so they hired people who knew how to do this kind of thing. Was it what Record Plant, I think? They got a bunch of engineers who had, mobile equipment that they could put in the boat. They could set up different rooms of the boat for, drum sound or guitars or whatever. They built a little outdoor enclosure for guitars so that there'd be some acoustic containment. Um, and it's an interesting chapter. They ran into lots of problems. They ran into problems with the captain of the boat where they were recording, who didn't quite realize the amount of equipment that was going to be, put into the boat, not to mention that there'd be construction on the boat, to build some of these acoustic spaces. But in terms of, hanging off the edge, getting sick, I guess they mostly weren't that way because they would sort of spend the rest of the day swimming and messing around. So I think they were happy to have a kind of vacation. Paul often tries to do these sort of out of the way places so that he can combine a nice trip somewhere and a vacation with getting some work done. That was what Lagos was supposed to be, but he hadn't quite thought it through. And this is what the Virgin Islands was. So, yeah, we've got problems like, Denny going out in a catamaran for a few hours and getting lost and coming back burnt to a crisp. Uh, we had people having other injuries. Jimmy had a hearing problem at one point during the sessions. One of the managers broke a foot or sprained an ankle, something like that. Ended up in the hospital. So there was lots of this kind of stuff that went on, but there didn't seem to be real problems recording on a boat. You listen to the album, you don't hear wind noise in the microphones or anything like that. I mean, they have windscreens. So, the technical stuff they just conquered partly by hiring people who knew how to do this stuff for recording on a boat. I guess it's that simple.
Yeah.
For your information, by the way, I was just looking up in Paul's book the lyrics, and Mull of Kintyre is credited to Paul and Denny as songwriters, but the copyright is owned by Paul.
Mhm.
So when the song is reissued, it'll be interesting to see whether or not the credit is McCartney Lane as it is in here, or whether it reverts to McCartney. But the copyright is solely owned by Paul now. So there you go.
Okay. Ken, do you have anything else you want to chime in with? And then we have to talk about the contest, which we haven't done so yet, which is ongoing, the McCartney
Okay.
Legacy contest. But if you have anything else, Ken, you want to touch on?
I find it fascinating and not really all that shocking that Paul is constantly writing music. Even when he's on vacation, he's writing music. He goes to Hawaii and he writes girls' school and silly love songs. You know, I guess when he's taking a vacation, like you were saying with London Town, he's not just recording, but there are times when he's writing. He's constantly got ideas, and this book really brings that out. You know, there's hardly ever a time when he's not inspired to write something. And it's just incredible what a fertile mind he has for constantly writing over and over again. Um, I also found it interesting that I think Paul visited John more so than we realize. You know, there are a lot of visits there in New York. Whenever he was in New York, he tried to visit John and Yoko. And just makes you wonder that they were probably on much better terms than we know, except for the one time when he showed up, and that was the time, it was 76, I think it was, when John said you can't just turn up whenever you want, like whenever you feel like it. Um, but I found that to be pretty interesting. Um, and you kind of clear up the whole um, debate about did they watch Saturday Night Live together when Lorne Michaels made the offer to the Beatles? Because what John said turned out to be accurate. Paul said it was the following week when he was already performing, I think, was it?
Right. He just there was never another time when John and Paul could have been together on a Saturday night and to watch the show. So even if they were to watch a different show and John were to say, "Oh yeah, you should have seen a few weeks ago," it just didn't happen. Um, yeah, we just sort of looked at all the possible dates and what Saturday Night Live's season was that year, you know. So even with reruns, it just didn't happen. But yeah, that took a bit of doing, and it's only because, you know, with the Beatles, there are all these theories that always come up in the middle of nowhere, you know, like this story we heard can't really be right because whatever. And the whatever often has to do with what one of the Beatles say. You know, John told the story, Paul originally told the same story. It's only later that Paul began to say, you know, actually, that it's not really true. I talked to John like the week later, and um, why he did that, I've got no idea. You know, could just be to mess with the press, which was not beyond Paul. I mean, keep in mind that when he went to London during the Ram sessions, he met with the press at the airport and said, "I'm on my way to Paris to do some recording." But he was just going back to, they were in California by then. He was just going back there. You know, why did he tell the press, "I'm going to Paris"? I don't know. You know, sometimes people who can mess with the press just like to mess with the press. I've seen it happen many times.
This is this is something we have to deal with quite a lot, though. That, you know, Paul will make a statement, you know, now, and he'll say, "Oh no, we watched it a week after," and he's saying this in, you know, 2023, when we've got an interview with Paul in, you know, 77, saying that they were in this, you know, they were together the night it went out, and John talked about it multiple times. in interviews, and always said that they were together the night that it went out. So, from our perspective, we always go back to the interviews closest to the time, and we get the two people's perspectives and stories, and then we try and find the truth out of the two of them. But yeah, when someone makes a comment, nearly 50 years after the event, and people then take that as being accurate, it's deeply frustrating for us, to have to then explain that away when we know it's not true.
It's kind of like the Jet story, We, at the time Band on the Run came out, he talked a lot about Jet and how it was, a little dog. It was the runt of the litter. He really liked it. Here are all the other names of the dogs in the litter. By now, it's a horse. And in the lyrics, not only is it a horse, but we have a picture of the horse that it isn't. But that horse was also called Jet. But that horse was born after Jet was, already on vinyl. So, yeah, that's why, as Adrian says, we try to go back to the sources as close as we can to the events, on the theory that that's when the memories are the sharpest and most accurate.
Yeah, that pony Jet actually makes a cameo appearance in Vol.2, when Paul decides to record a homemade video for Mulev Kintyre at Abbey Road Studios, and he leads Jet across the famous Abbey Road crossing into the studio. So all those pictures you see online, those famous pictures, were taken on, I think, something like the 5th or 6th of December of that year that Mulev Kintyre came out. Because they decided that it would be a brilliant idea to make a video featuring this new pony that they'd acquired called Jet. But you can understand from Paul's perspective, when you're 40 years from the event and you can remember vividly this pony you had called Jet that would run through the fields and, and basically fit all of the lyrics of the song Jet. And at no point did anybody in the making of that project, point out to him the interview he did with Paul Gambaccini in 1974, where he said something different. So really, he's kind of only partially to blame, I think, for those things coming out. There needs to be people around him who say, "Oh, but hang on a minute, back in 74, you told a different story," and maybe push him in the right direction, which is what a good interviewer would do. Taking him at his word, is the interviewer is as much to blame as the interviewee, in my opinion, anyway.
Sometimes it's not that easy to correct someone.
Oh God, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Were you able to track down any of Jet's relatives and get the horse perspective, or did was it? Anyway, I think
yes, we did. We did, Darren. We found his son.
We did. Jet's son.
Was your father the Jet that the song is written about? And he said, nay.
Nay. And then singing
I'm so sorry.
Of course. All right, we've kind of are now heading down into the so let's talk about a year ago, it was last year at the Fest for Beatle Fans. We had a panel. And it was the Things We Said Today panel, where we discussed something that Allan just briefly alluded to, the unique places that Wings recorded their albums, the Virgin Islands for London Town, Africa for Back to the Egg. And hopefully we're able to do a similar type thing in late March when we convene in person. Is that English? We convene in person? When we gather in person in Jersey City at the Fest for Beatle Fans 2025, when we will hopefully do something similar to these two shows that we've had, and we'll do it in person behind a desk or without a desk. But the contest, we are giving away three copies of the McCartney Legacy Volume 2, 1974 to 80. We started the contest last week with part one of our discussion with Allan and Adrian. Now we've completed the second of the two parts. And pretty much you can enter this contest through the month of January. We're going to
26.
the end of the month, right? The 27th. We make it up as we go, folks. But the 27th, that's right. And here's what you have to do. If you'd like to win a copy, one of the 3 copies we have available, we need you to send us an email and in the subject line, McCartney book, make it clear if it's McCartney Legacy book or whatever, make it clear that this is an entry for our contest. And the email address is, and I don't have it written down here and I never remember it. I've only been on the show now, what, 7, 8 years?
Things we said today, radio show at gmail.com.
Email us there with the subject line, again, McCartney book. Give us your address. I know some folks have not been providing an address. Now, if someone who didn't give us an address wins, we'll still reach out and be able to get you your book. But to make our lives easier, and you see how confused I get, you put me in the middle of this whole thing. Give us your address, please. This is for U.S. residents only. I apologize to those of you living outside of the United States. And we need you to answer a trivia question. Wings had 2 top 10 hit singles
In the United States,
in the United
according to
States, not
Billboard's-
number ones, although one could be a number
One
one.
was.
All right. Wings had 2 top 10 hit singles in the US, according to Billboard. And they were both live songs. Just 2 live songs. What were they? And tell us the answer in your email with your name and address and any other pertinent information. And the subject line being McCartney book contest, something of that nature. And best of luck. And we will take your entries until the end of the month, 27th. We'll cut it off. We'll pick a winner, 3 winners actually, and you'll get copies of the McCartney Legacy Volume 2. So.
And actually, one of the songs did hit number 1. I did
Right.
say that in the
Yeah,
last show.
that's good. Listen, I have it written down here too. And it's so neat and I look at it, I just see colors and arrows and it doesn't make any sense. Tell me you could figure this out in a pinch. Okay? Anyway, so I guess that's about it.
Okay.
Can I ask 1 or 2 more questions?
Absolutely, sure you can.
Can
You
you
want-
tell us a little bit more? I know we discussed the sci-fi film that Paul approached Isaac Asimov with. Later on in the book, he spoke to Gene Roddenberry about doing a film together. The same idea, I'm sure. What ever happened with that? Did Gene just turn him down, or what?
Yeah, so we cover this in the book, and it's probably best not to give the whole story away.
Okay.
But basically, Paul went to Roddenberry with the idea, and they spent some time developing it further. And what ended up happening was that Paul, being a great follower of Hollywood, he attended a showing of a certain science fiction movie in 1977. And when he went home, he realized that anything he did with Roddenberry wasn't going to live up to the standards that were being, produced by Hollywood at the time. So Paul decided to pull the plug on the science fiction project. It wasn't a case of, falling out with Roddenberry or the project didn't work out. It was a case of, Paul realized himself that, what they were hoping to achieve with the film would need a multi-million pound budget, as was the case then in 1977. So yeah, he pulled the plug on the whole project.
Yeah. Okay. I'm almost done with the book. I haven't quite finished it yet, but I'm getting there. I'm in the final stretch. And one last thing, I mean, about a Beatles reunion, and I know that Paul was tired of talking about it, but we also know that when he signed with CBS, that there was a stipulation in his contract that would allow him to record with the other Beatles if the situation arose. And, the tough thing about talking about a Beatles reunion is at any given time, they could all have different opinions. One can be in favor of the other 3 could be against it. But it seemed to me that if any one of the 4 of them would ever have wanted a reunion, it would have been Paul. enough so that he wanted that in his contract. Do you think that he felt going towards the end of the 70s that it was very likely something could be happening? Um, I just find it interesting that he wanted that in his contract.
I think it was just a contingency, just in case, just because you never know, just because every time they talked about it at any length, he basically pointed out, and the others did too, that, it's nothing that at this point we're absolutely against. It just takes someone to say, let's do it, and all of us to agree to do it. So maybe he felt that it eventually would happen and he wanted to be contractually okay with Columbia, because Columbia could have prevented it. I mean, that would have that wouldn't have been good PR for them, but he just wanted to make sure that in this one case he had that contractual out if he needed to.
I think what you'll see in the book as well, towards the end of the 70s, is that the money that was still trapped in Apple's bank accounts,
Mm.
even after they'd settled things on paper at the end of 1974, they still had this vast pot of money in Apple's bank accounts that needed to be divided between the four of them, and that still wasn't settled by 1979, and that was still a huge sticking point between the four of them. So I think really there was optimism possibly on Paul's part that they would finally reach a settlement. And but even by 83, 84, that was still the thought going through Paul's head was optimism that they would still find a settlement. And I think it took a few years after that point for them to divide that pot of cash up. Was it as late as 89 or something, Alan? It was quite a long time, wasn't it?
Well, in '89 they had other issues between themselves and with Capital, but yeah, I'm not sure when it was finally
Yeah,
laid to rest.
but yeah, we're talking, a very long time after the Beatles supposedly settled their business differences, as we all believe was the case, in December 1974, that pot of cash was finally divided between the four of them, and all of that tension dispersed. So yeah, I think that's possibly another reason why that was included as a clause in Paul's contract with Columbia, is that maybe he was, feeling that they would finally come to a resolution, which they never did.
Hmm. And can you give the ultimate reason why Jimmy was let go of Wings? I mean, we all know that he was difficult in his own way with drug and alcohol abuse, and he caused a lot of problems within the band, and especially with having to have to delay the Wings Over America tour because of his accident and all of that. But, you know, what was there one moment where Paul just said, "That's it, I've had enough," no pun intended?
Yeah, I mean it's there in the book, isn't it? When Jimmy exits the band, he exits in a hail of not bullets, it's sort of ketchup and eggs across Paul's farmhouse. And I think this is the very same farmhouse that Paul's just had renovated so they can record Mull of Kintyre, at
Hmm.
great expense. So I guess it was probably just the straw that broke the camel's back, really. Well, not so much the straw, was it? It was the ketchup and the eggs that broke the camel's back in the end. And it was enough, and that was it. Jimmy was out. But it's interesting, when you'll see in the book, and we found this out for ourselves, that even after Jimmy had left the group, he was still giving interviews when he was staying at a hotel in Glasgow, and almost kind of alluding to the fact that he was in the band but wasn't in the band, and even talking about a recording session that he wasn't present for. So it was a really strange kind of exit. And then there must have been, as we've discovered with every member of the group who left, some conversation with Paul's management, Brian Brolly. Jimmy will have been offered a sum of money, probably for the recording he'd done up until that stage on London Town, and on the single as well, Mull of Kintyre and Girls' School. and probably asked to sign some piece of paper, and then he went on his way. But yeah, I can't imagine Paul was particularly happy when Jimmy redecorated his, newly renovated farmhouse with ketchup. What do you think, Alan?
I think that was the straw that broke the camel's back. I mean, it clearly was the straw that broke the camel's back. So, yeah, that was the one incident that you're asking about, but it comes with a whole backlog of incidents, and it just was enough. He was really quite upset, and the funny thing about it as well is that, Denny, who is Jimmy's big ally, immediately hightails it up to High Park to tell Paul that all hell has broken loose and it's nothing to do with me. So it was kind of funny,
And that's maybe where the title of the next album came from. Back to the Egg. Okay.
Very good, Darren.
Well, maybe thinking on that thing, Darren. Maybe Jimmy was just trying to recreate the lyrics from Cook of the House.
I was just trying to help, guys.
He was just reaching around that kitchen for everything that they were describing, and
with each handful of scrambled eggs, these ideas are popping into my head, Paul. You got to believe me. Adrian, thank you so much for spending so much time with us.
So my pleasure.
You win for it in a couple of years when Volume 3 is out. Because
I'd like to think you'll have me back before then, Darren.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Absolutely, of course. And we're looking forward to as I mentioned a little while ago, the Fest for Beatles fans, and the final weekend in March is happening in Jersey City. Adrian will be coming over because he has to. He said, before I leave this earth, I need to see Jersey City. So Adrian will join us there, and Alan's going to come on down. We're going to have a good old time, and I'm going to give lots of bad information and wrong information about stuff that we're doing and mix people up. And but thank you again, Adrian, and congratulations on the book, The McCartney Legacy, Vol.2, 1974 to 80, from Allan Kozinn and Adrian Sinclair. And I hope you enjoyed this second part of our two-part discussion here on Things We Said Today. Quickly before we go, send Ken off with have a great time in Nashville and Memphis. You're going to as well.
Yep.
Enjoy the Ringo shows at the Ryman Auditorium. And when Ken's back at the end of the month, we'll put a wrap on our McCartney book contest, congratulate the winners, and look up Ringo Starr's new album and Ken's experience of seeing the shows at the Ryman. So that'll be our next show, and that'll be towards the end of January. So keep that in mind. And once again, thank you to Adrian, and thanks to everybody for spending time with us and watching things and listening to Things We Said Today. Take care.